You're 8 years old. Your mom doesn't believe in drying clothes in an electric dryer. She thinks they dry more naturally on a drying rack, so she uses her electric dryer as an ice tub to keep her lettuce wedges chilled and ready to eat. You're hungry for a midday snack, so your mom goes to the basement and burrows through the ice tub to look for the perfect lettuce wedge for you to eat. It's green and smells like a soft cobalt pillow on a Christmas day. She brings the lettuce wedge upstairs and unwraps it and puts it on your plate. You say, "But Mom, I don't like lettuce wedges as a midday snack." And she replies, "Eric, you're a grown boy. If you ever want to be strong and handsome like Bill Pullman, you eat your lettuce wedges." And you say, "Okay, Mom, but can I eat it upstairs? I'd like to do some afternoon birding as I ingest this soft, green, pillowy iron bomb." And she says, "Okay, but I'll check your plate in 15 minutes to see if you ate it." You walk upstairs with your gigantic lettuce wedge, and little does she know, you have a whole cooler filled with the finest Thousand Island dressing, imported from upstate New York. You break out a fresh squeezer, and you dump that beautiful pinkish hue on that great green block. And you eat up the whole lettuce wedge and lick off all the Thousand Island dressing off the plate in 7 minutes and 38 seconds. And you come running back downstairs and say, "Look, Mom, I ate the whole lettuce wedge. I'm gonna grow big and strong like the best actor to ever grace our presence, Bill Pullman." And she says, "Oh, Eric, I'm proud to have a son just like you. If only your 7 Catholic brothers weren't such horrible little runts, maybe they'd be like my eldest boy, my Bill Pullman of the future." And this is why today I'm going to be talking about Thousand Island dressing. Why is there always controversy surrounding great culinary inventions? I've heard other culinary origin stories that make people angry, like a Croatian invented the pizza and the Chinese invented spaghetti, or that the Reuben was actually made by a chef at Reuben's Delicatessen instead of Arnold Reuben himself, or was it made in Nebraska? Well, years later, after I ate that faded lettuce wedge, I was driving through Ontario along the St. Lawrence River, and I saw a sign for the Thousand Islands. And I thought to myself, wouldn't that be funny if this is where Thousand Island dressing came from? And the majority of sources that I read say that this is exactly the case, except it came from the New York side. Many today know that Thousand Island dressing is a great dressing for a salad or a sandwich, and it was the basis for McDonald's Big Mac sauce, which was put on Le Big Mac. But then I started reading into the controversy, because what would a culinary origin story be without one? There are 3 different popular theories on the origins of Thousand Island dressing, but first I'd like to go into a little Thousand Island history, as I always like to do a little history before I get into the meat of the subject. So the Thousand Islands is what they call an archipelago, or an island chain, and this consists of 1,864 islands that stretch from the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario. It is of course bordered by the US state of New York and the Canadian province of Ontario, and the islands lay on both the American and Canadian side. Now many of these islands aren't that big, as the measurement used by the Canadian government to officially consider a plot of land an island is that it needs to be above water year-round, it needs to support 2 living trees, and it needs to be at least 1 square foot. Before the Europeans colonized this place, there were of course First Nations people that lived here, mainly the Iroquois, the Algonquin, and the Ojibwe. In one article I found, an author named Don Roth said, "According to First Nations legend, the Great Spirit deeded this paradise to the people, if only they would return to peace." He then shook his head and said, "Never happened." Now in Algonquin legend, the Great Spirit is called Manitou, and the Manitou is a spirit that flows through everything, including land, people, animals, and any events that may take place. And now I think it's important to not confuse this idea with the idea of a monotheistic God. I almost take this as a form of karma. If you harm the Great Spirit or the Manitou in the form of harming an animal or a land or a people, then bad things will happen to you. But if you treat people, animals, and land well, then the Great Spirit that flows through everything will shine favorably upon you. Ross finished his thought by saying, "The Manitou sent warriors to gather up paradise in an animal hide, but they dropped a corner of the hide. Thousands of rocks fell to the earth, fragments of that promised land." Now if you go back to my first video, the Great Lakes Stonehenge Debunked, you'll learn how glaciers formed the Great Lakes and all the islands that are contained within. But I like to think that a Great Spirit causing thousands of rocks to fall to the earth, taking shape in the form of islands, is actually a pretty cool theory. Nonetheless, the Garden of the Great Spirit was eventually discovered by French explorers in 1650. And now, so we don't get too in the weeds here, the French had it for a while and they set up forts, including one near present-day Kingston, Ontario. And this fort was called Fort Frontenac. And now the British, who obviously sent up many colonies south of the Thousand Islands, didn't like the French much. They wanted to control trade on the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. There was actually a battle here called the Battle of the Thousand Islands, and this took place on August 16th, 1760 to August 24th, 1760. Although to call it a battle was questionable, it was really a mollywhopping of the French. Only 26 Brits were killed, and 275 Frenchmen were killed or wounded. You see, this area was crucial for trading the profitable resources that were found around the area, included but not limited to the fur trade. The St. Lawrence River connected to the Atlantic Ocean, where you could export goods back to Europe. Whoever owned this region could bring in massive profits from trading. All of this conflict was part of the 7 Years' War, where the Brits would reign supreme over the French once again, and the aforementioned Fort Frontenac would become British territory. So the British took control, and they eat their porridge, their meat pies, their bangers and mash, and they travel up and down the river, drinking brandy and kissing the feet of King George. But little did the British know, their imperial presence in the 13 colonies south of the St. Lawrence River was soon going to come to a close. After the Revolutionary War, which resulted in the United States gaining its independence, there were still people that were loyal to the crown, and they didn't want to live in a country that wasn't loyal to it. And some Americans were even deported by the American government to Canada. So between 1775 and 1785, about 60,000 American-born people immigrated to Canada, and about 2,000 of them settled along the St. Lawrence River. This also included a small portion of freedom seekers who wanted to escape enslavement in the American South. Furthermore, there was about 30,000 American-born people that immigrated to Canada between 1790 and 1810 due to King George offering free land to those that deserted the United States. You see, Canada had not yet become one whole colony, and it was split up between Upper Canada and Lower Canada after the Constitutional Act of 1791. Upper Canada was meant for English speakers with an English court system and a lot more English influence in the area, and Lower Canada was meant for French speakers with a French court system and a lot more French influence in the area. Also, the United States may have gained independence, but it didn't stop Great Britain from consistently meddling in the affairs of the United States. The US was still exporting goods to Europe, and Britain was not happy that the US was trading with an enemy of theirs, France. So Britain and the Royal Navy would impose restrictions on trade from the US, and what they would do is impress Americans that were traveling on ship in the Atlantic Ocean or around Europe. And no, I don't mean impress them by performing Hey Jude on harpsichord. I mean that they would abduct Americans and make them work for the Royal Navy. And this ended up leading to the War of 1812. Now, I don't want to go over every detail here because we'd easily spend over an hour covering this whole subject. But basically, the United States and President James Madison thought that if they took Canada, that Britain would stop imposing restrictions on trade from them and they'd stop abducting their mariners. But unlike the Revolutionary War, which was mostly fought on land, the US was no match for the Royal Navy, and they had a lot of trouble taking any territory in Canada. There were several skirmishes fought on the Thousand Islands, and many more fought on the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. As this war essentially started due to maritime trading, so control of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes was crucial. Due to the many people that died in this war, it's led to some believing that the Thousand Islands are haunted, and you can even take ghost tours to this day. After many battles, thousands of lives lost, and the U.S. Capitol and the presidential palace basically being burnt to the ground, the war would end on February 17th, 1815, after the U.S. Congress ratified the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent essentially said that Britain would stop impressing American soldiers and that the borders between the U.S. and Canada would return to their previous status. Some historians say that the end of this war marked the real end of the American Revolution, as it solidified the borders between the U.S. and Canada, and it made it so that the U.S. got Britain off their back. And the Thousand Islands would remain a place for shipbuilding and trade until the Gilded Age, around the time when Canada had their own revolution in 1867 and established themselves as an independent country still sovereign to the crown. So this next part, I'm going to get into the first theory about the creation of Thousand Island dressing, but to get there, I have to describe a bit about how the Thousand Islands became a vacation destination for industrialists in Canada and the American Northeast. So there are differing point of views as to when the Gilded Age started. Some say it was when Civil War and legal slavery ended in 1865. Others say it was when Reconstruction ended in 1877, and it lasted into the late 1890s or early 1900s. Regardless, this era was marked by the expansion of the railroads and tremendous wealth blowing gold over North America as industrialization expanded rapidly. But it was also marked by little to no environmental protections, little to no regulation of business, and no antitrust laws. So blue-collar workers worked for long hours and low wages. There were horrible conditions for the working class, and no antitrust laws meant people could create monopolies, and the people who reaped the benefits of this wealth inequality were called robber barons. And of course, the robber barons enjoyed vacationing, and what better place to vacation than one of the most beautiful land archipelagos in the world, the Thousand Islands. During the Gilded Age, five-star hotels and vacation homes were built on the Thousand Islands, and the wealthiest people even built yacht houses to hold their yachts that would traverse the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, and some even built opulent castles. One of the men who tried to build a castle on one of these islands on the Thousand Islands is a man by the name of George Boldt, and he is the first character in our salad dressing story. Boldt was born in 1851 in what was then Prussia and is now modern-day Germany on an island called Rügen. He immigrated here in 1864 at the age of 13, and he worked in kitchens for 12 years before he became a dining room manager at an exclusive Philadelphia gentlemen's club, the Philadelphia Club. The Philadelphia Club is still around today and holds the title of the oldest city club in the United States. Boldt then turned his fortunes into buying and running hotels. As I said before, the Gilded Age was marked by immense wealth, and Boldt knew that out-of-town visitors wanted a luxurious place to stay, eat, and rest their heads for the night. The first hotel Boldt opened was in 1881 in Philadelphia, and it was called the Bellevue Hotel. This afforded him enough money to then buy a competitor's hotel in the Stratford Hotel. This would become the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Around this time in 1867, a man by the name of J.B. Sutherland developed and patented the first refrigerated train car in Detroit. And then a man named William Davis, also from Detroit, developed and patented the first physical iteration of the refrigerated train car. Davis soon died in 1868, and his family sold the patent for the refrigerated train car to a man by the name of George H. Hammond, who was in the meat packing business. Hammond then made a fortune off the refrigerated train car, as it made it so that food could be shipped on the railroads. And so in the 1890s, people in the East started to receive iceberg lettuce from California, and this created a salad craze in New York. For people in the East, often grew greens that were bitter and not tasty to eat. George Boldt had many friends in New York City, and this allegedly led to the place where Thousand Island dressing got famous. Boldt knew a pair of cousins in New York called William Waldorf-Astoria and John Jacob Astor. These men came from a long line of inherited wealth, from fur trading and real estate development. In 1893, William Waldorf-Astoria opened the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, with George Boldt as the proprietor. Boldt and his wife Louise actually picked out many of the antiques in the Waldorf Hotel from a European trip that they made a year before. John Jacob Astor then opened the Astoria Hotel in 1897, and George Boldt was a mediator between the two, as apparently the cousins just didn't get along. Fun fact, the Waldorf-Astoria was the first hotel to have electricity and private bathrooms in every guest room. And the original Waldorf-Astoria Hotel was bulldozed in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. So if you're standing in the Empire State Building, you're standing where the original Waldorf-Astoria was. You may have heard of the name John Jacob Astor. In 1911, when him and his wife, Madeline, were honeymooning overseas in Europe and Egypt, she became pregnant. By April of 1912, Madeline was ready to have the baby, and John Jacob Astor, being the man of great wealth that he was, bought them tickets on the most luxurious ocean liner ever built to that point, called the Titanic. They boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg, France, and this officially made him the wealthiest man on the entire ship. 25 minutes before the Titanic sank, John Jacob Astor actually put his wife, daughter, and one other woman on one of the last lifeboats to leave the Titanic. His wife, her new baby, and his daughter would go on to live after Astor sank with the ship that night. He would be portrayed by the famous soap opera star Eric Braeden in the 1997 blockbuster movie Titanic. Anyway, back to the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel. The hotel quickly became known for hosting wealthy foreign customers. It also became known for its food, which included the Waldorf salad, and apparently the first origin of Thousand Island dressing. So the aforementioned hotel entrepreneur, George Boldt, had owned a cottage on the New York side of the Thousand Islands. And the first theory of origin of Thousand Island dressing has to do with George Boldt, his wife, and some guests cruising the Thousand Islands on their yacht. One day, they became hungry. George, his wife Louise, who he named the boat after, and their guests, wanted to eat a salad, but they accidentally left the fixings for salad dressing at the boat dock. The only person who knew anything about food on the yacht was a man by the name of Oscar Tschirky. Tschirky was a famed restaurateur and the maitre d' of the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel. He eventually garnered the nickname Oscar of the Waldorf for how accommodating he was to his guests. Tschirky then scrambled and whipped up whatever he could find in the kitchen on the yacht. And what he allegedly whipped up in the kitchen of the yacht that day was a mix of mayonnaise, ketchup, pickled relish, Worcestershire sauce, and a hard-boiled egg, the original recipe for Thousand Island dressing. And due to it being allegedly created while cruising the Thousand Islands, this was then called Thousand Island dressing and put on the menu at the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel. Now, if this were true, this may have happened at the turn of the 20th century, but I can't find a picture or any newspaper clipping that actually says that Thousand Island dressing or a Thousand Island salad was on the menu at the Waldorf-Astoria at that time, which is what makes this culinary origin story so complicated. There's a frustrating lack of proof to most of these claims, and I can't even find a year that this would have been put on the Waldorf-Astoria's menu. A search on newspapers.com shows that the first time Thousand Island dressing was ever written in a newspaper as a single phrase was on October 20th, 1912 in the Kansas City Post, where it said that the Hotel Baltimore served a salad with Thousand Island dressing on it. And this date would be far after any claim of Thousand Island dressing origin. You'd think that if it was actually served at the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel, it would have been written about in a newspaper somewhere. Maybe it was truly kept to word of mouth, but according to newspapers.com, it was written about in newspapers in 1913 131 times from California all the way to Vermont. A little more background on George Boldt and the Thousand Islands. In 1900, after amassing great wealth with his hotels, Boldt decided to build a castle on one of the Thousand Islands called Hart Island. And he wanted to build this castle for his wife, Louise Kerr Boldt. He loved his wife so much he even instructed for the builders to put hearts all over this castle, and he named his yacht after her. Louise was also a key part in garnering the upscale reputation for Boldt's hotels. You see, at the time, many of the wives of these wealthy hotel residents were often confined to domesticity, and Louise wanted to have places in the hotel for them to get away from their husbands. So she was responsible for adding more of a feminine quality by helping decorate each of Boldt's hotels while coming up with the idea to leave fresh flowers in every room, placing candles on tables, and leaving pincushions on the dresser of every room. Although I can't find the exact reason for her illness, she apparently had been in poor health for quite some time, and in 1904, she died due to heart disease. George Boldt, in the middle of getting this castle constructed for them, was so heartbroken they immediately stopped the construction of the castle in Hart Island, and he would never step foot on the island again, leaving Boldt Castle empty and to the elements. It would be left vacant for 73 years until the Thousand Island Bridge Authority decided to restore it so that tourists could visit the historical house. At first, the Bridge Authority just wanted to finish what Boldt had started and to restore the island to its previous beauty. But the castle became such an example of restored Gilded Age opulence that the Bridge Authority has continued renovating and adding to it. As of 2020, they've spent over $50 million renovating Boldt Castle, Hart Island, and George Boldt's yacht house at nearby Wellesley Island. You can now visit all of these places today. Legend has it that Boldt Castle is haunted though, so beware, as dating all the way back to Louise's death, people have said that they've seen apparitions of her near the yacht house on Wellesley Island. Some say that they have seen George walking through the halls of the castle, while workers at Boldt Castle say they have heard ghostly footsteps and have seen lights turning on and off by themselves. As for George Boldt and Oscar Tschirky's claim to being the originator of Thousand Island dressing, Tschirky released a voluminous cookbook around this time called Oscar of the Waldorf, and none of these pages contained any recipe about Thousand Island dressing. It's curious as to why Tschirky wouldn't put such a famous dressing in his cookbook, and there isn't much other proof that he had created the recipe for Thousand Island dressing that day, as the papers never wrote about it. And one more reason to not believe this story, the oral history says that Louise was on the boat that day when Oscar Tschirky created Thousand Island dressing. Louise died in 1904, and no newspapers ever wrote about Thousand Island dressing until 1912. And I find it highly unlikely that this allegedly famous salad dressing at the Waldorf-Astoria was never written about in any newspaper. It was truly created sometime between 1895 and 1904 when Louise died. Now for the second theory for the origins of Thousand Island dressing, we will take a train over to Chicago on the shores of Lake Michigan. This theory is a less popular theory that not many believe, but is still worth some merit. So Chicago at the time was filled with many Union stockyards. The first president of those Union stockyards was a man by the name of Timothy Blackstone. Blackstone had made his money engineering railroads. He oversaw construction of the Illinois Central Railroad, and then was the chief engineer of the Chicago and Alton Railroad that connected Chicago to St. Louis and Kansas City, Missouri. Blackstone had built a house on Michigan Avenue, which wasn't just a bunch of retail shops at this time, but rather another example of Gilded Age wealth, where mansions and hotels were constructed. Blackstone loved the railroad so much that he actually refused a salary as president of the Union Stockyards, instead living off his own investments. But on May 26, 1900, he suddenly got pneumonia and passed away around the same time George Boldt had started building his never-completed mansion on the Thousand Islands. Timothy Blackstone's wife, Isabella Blackstone, would sell the Blackstone mansion to a couple of brothers by the name of John and Tracy Drake. And you may know that name now because of the famous Drake Hotel that still stands peering over Lake Michigan. They would eventually bulldoze the Blackstone mansion in 1908 with plans to build a hotel in place of where the mansion was. By 1910, they followed through on their plans, and to celebrate, they hosted a grand opening for this towering ode to neoclassical architecture. They of course hired a top-notch chef for their progressive-era hotel, and that chef was a man by the name of Theo Rooms. Allegedly, a salad that contained Thousand Island dressing was on the opening night menu for the Blackstone Hotel, but there is no picture or proof of this claim. Theo Rooms had simply called this dressing Blackstone dressing, but eventually the Blackstone Hotel's maitre d', Albert Awater, would rename it Thousand Island dressing after vacationing on the islands. Blackstone dressing first shows up in a newspaper called the Fargo Forum and Daily Republican on March 29, 1913. And as far as I can tell, this was the first time Blackstone dressing had ever been talked about in a newspaper. But what's odd is that Thousand Island dressing had already been talked about in Kansas City, Missouri in 1912. Is it all possible that somebody got the recipe for Blackstone dressing, then they took the same railroad that Timothy Blackstone engineered all those years ago, then renamed it Thousand Island dressing over at the Baltimore Hotel in Kansas City? Or maybe, does the Baltimore Hotel have its own claim to Thousand Island dressing? We simply can't ever know. This is then followed up by Chef Theo Rooms getting an award in 1925 that says he was the creator of Thousand Island dressing, and this award is actually documented at the Chicago Culinary Museum. Now, what I think makes this theory unlikely is that Thousand Island dressing had allegedly already shown up at the Waldorf Hotel way before the Blackstone Hotel had ever opened. Not to mention, the Blackstone was a bit self-important, even calling itself the Hotel of Presidents due to nearly every president up to Jimmy Carter staying there at least once. It also has claim to the origin of the phrase smoke-filled room, as apparently Republican leaders had picked Warren G. Harding to run for president in 1920 at the Blackstone Hotel while chomping on cigars, with the Republican National Convention happening nearby. It also was a hangout for Al Capone, who would get his haircut at a barbershop in the Blackstone due to the barbershop not having any windows. And this hotel was actually used in the 1987 film The Untouchables, in one of the most famous film scenes of all time, where Al Capone, played by Robert De Niro, hosts a banquet that ends in a rather bloody manner. Regardless, the fact that Thousand Island dressing and Blackstone dressing first started showing up in newspapers in 1912 and 1913, as opposed to before the Blackstone Hotel even opened, actually gives this theory some merit. But this next theory is what I will deem the most likely theory. So the last and final theory, which I personally think is the most believable, is the theory that a woman named Sophia Lalonde invented the dressing. Sophia was born in 1874 in Clayton, New York, which is a riverside town right next to the Thousand Islands and on the St. Lawrence River. Sophia eventually married a man named George Lalonde Jr., who was an avid fisherman, and he made his money as a fishing guide on the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, often fishing for bass and pike. Sophia, wanting her husband to have delicious meals as he spent the days fishing, created a sauce to go with the salads she packed with him for lunch, and she called this Sophia's sauce. One day, when George was taking a famous actress by the name of May Irwin and her husband out on his boat for a fishing trip, he introduced them to his wife's salad dressing. May Irwin, originally from Canada, had a summer home with her partner on Club Island, which is part of the Thousand Islands chain. She was also a famous cook who had already written her own cookbook. She liked this sauce so much that she asked Sophia for the recipe, and Sophia, flattered by May's interest in her salad dressing, gave her the recipe. Fun fact, May Irwin was part of the first ever on-screen kiss that was recorded for film by Thomas Edison himself. The film was called The Kiss, and it's actually been preserved by the National Film Registry because of its cultural significance. Sadly, Irwin was also in a lot of racist Broadway and cinematic productions of that time that were inspired from minstrel shows. May Irwin would eventually go back to New York City, and it was here that it said she gave the recipe to George Boldt, a fellow vacationer on the Thousand Islands, and George Boldt then gave it to his maitre d', Oscar Tschirky, who would put it on the Waldorf-Astoria hotel menu. Sophia Lalonde also gave this recipe to a nearby hotel in Clayton, New York, called the Herald Hotel. This was where it was reportedly first served to the public. The Herald Hotel would eventually be turned into the Thousand Islands Inn, And when a man by the name of Alan Benes bought this hotel in 1972, he'd opened the safe to that hotel the next year, and this was where he allegedly found a piece of paper with the original recipe to Thousand Island dressing on it. But, in this CBS News clip here, he also claims that this piece of paper with the recipe on it disintegrated, and that they copied the original recipe so that they could make it themselves. Now, if that piece of paper hadn't disintegrated, maybe, just maybe, somebody could carbon date that piece of paper to actually figure out when and where it was from. But of course, it's not there anymore, so no one can double check this work, and if you pardon me for a second, I'm going to scream. The reason I do believe the Lalonde theory is the most simple fact that this was called Thousand Island dressing. Why did that name catch on if it didn't originate from around here? Blackstone dressing sounds just as catchy as Thousand Island dressing to me. And as I said before, Louise Boldt died in 1904, 8 years before Thousand Island dressing was ever mentioned in any newspaper. And if the oral history is true, she was reportedly on the boat the day that it was created. It's just rather suspicious to me that the Waldorf-Astoria allegedly had this famous salad for several years without anyone ever writing about it, especially when the Waldorf-Astoria was constantly written about between 1900 and 1910. If you search on newspapers.com, you can see that the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel was actually written about 181,534 times between 1900 to 1910. So why wouldn't anyone mention this delicious salad that was on the menu? But the thing is, we can't even confirm if George Boldt and Oscar Tschirky had claimed to create Thousand Island dressing. This is all just based on oral histories, which seem to differ between everyone around the region. So if you out there in viewerland have some kind of written proof or a picture of Thousand Island dressing being talked about before 1912, when it was supposedly introduced to the world, I ask you to please share a link to a picture of it in the comments so we can finally get to the bottom of the mystery once and for all. But I will also plead with you to not just say, Theory X is the true theory, without showing any proof to that matter. Because that is exactly what everyone has done while bickering over this origin story, only going off oral histories instead of any actual written proof. I'm a fan of oral histories, but I don't take them as gospel if I can't find an iota of evidence to back it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the origins of Thousand Island dressing. Next time, we'll be talking about the haunting of the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse. I love me a good haunting story, and I love me a good lighthouse. And I'll even be shooting part of this narration on location near the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse since it's not far away from me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and thank you for watching.